مرحبا بكم مشاهدينا في حوارات السياق. أبرم الملياردير إيلون ماسك صفقة لشراء منصة التواصل الاجتماعي تويتر، وأطلق وعودا بتقليل الرقابة على المنصة، ما أثار تساؤلات حول ما سيعنيه نهجه لموقع التواصل الاجتماعي. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف ينضم إلينا ريني مدير الإنترنت وبحوث التكنولوجيا في مركز بيو للأبحاث. سيد لي، مرحبا بك معنا.
I'm delighted to be with you.
ما الذي يعنيه امتلاك ماسك لتويتر فيما يتعلق بحرية التعبير؟
There are important concerns in America about freedom of expression, and it's also important to point out that Elon Musk has been approved to take over Twitter by the board of directors of Twitter, but there are regulatory steps that still have to take place in the United States to approve this purchase. And so it hasn't yet happened. So your viewers need to be aware that this might not happen. It might actually fall through. When he purchased Twitter, Mr. Musk has said he wants to promote freedom of expression, which is a really important primary value in the United States. But there are lots of concerns about what happens on social media. There are people who are harassed. There are people who are threatened. There are people who promote misinformation. And so there are important issues that are also connected to free speech that Mr. Musk will have to be contending with as he takes over the company.
مفهوم. لماذا هذه المخاوف من حرية تعبير ماسك يعبر عنها فقط جناح واحد في أمريكا، أقصد هنا الليبراليين والديمقراطيين، فيما يرحب المحافظون والجمهوريون بصفقة ماسك؟
You have to understand the big change that has happened in American culture, but also the culture around the world, as social media has become a really important part of the information ecosystem in the past decade. Many more people now can command a public platform and say what they want in ways that they didn't have the power to say before social media was invented. So there are lots of ways in which this allows people to tell their stories, to influence the culture, to find other people who approve of the things that they approve of or like them, and also to challenge the things that are going on. So there's a big concern now that as so many more people can contribute their stories and contribute information, that some of the boundaries of information have been lowered. People can say bad things to each other. People can threaten each other. People can promote misinformation that is quite harmful as pandemics sweep through the world, as wars and conflicts sweep through the world. And so there are ways in which have always been American concerns about the impact of free speech, even as Americans love the idea of free speech. So there are right now in the culture, the conservative forces in the United States feel that there are too many limits on free speech, and particularly feel that social media companies are too much limiting the right of Americans to express their points of view. And liberals are more concerned about some of the impacts of that free speech. People can be threatened, people can be challenged, people can be influenced by misinformation. And so there's this great tension that exists right now in the culture that has been a long-standing tension throughout America. Even before the internet, even before social media, Americans have argued a lot about what exactly free speech means. And this argument now has a lot more urgency now that social media, and particularly Twitter, is part of the story.
من حديثك يبدو الأمر وكأنه مهمة مستحيلة، توفيق بين من يريدون المزيد من الحريات في تويتر والخائفون من التشدد والانتهاكات. ما الحل باعتقادك؟
I love your idea that this is a very difficult problem to solve, and Americans have lots of rules and lots of laws and lots of legal cases that are central to the idea of what free speech really means. And so there are going to be ways that Mr. Musk is going to wrestle with the tensions that have existed inside Twitter, inside other social media platforms from the day that they were invented. who gets to speak, what are they allowed to say, when should they be stopped from saying things if it brings harm or menace or threats to other people. And it's almost like Twitter will have to create its own legal regime to cope with all of these things. And that's just a big tension inside the company that doesn't go away now that it has new ownership. It'll be interesting to see how the new owners treat these issues differently from the former owners.
طيب لو أردنا أن نفصل أكثر في الحلول لمعضلة ماسك في إدارته لتويتر، جاك دورسي قال إن ما تم اتخاذه من إجراءات في السابق كانت أهدافه نبيلة لكنه خرج عنها عند التطبيق، وقال إن ماسك هو الذي يستطيع إصلاح الأمر. ما رأيك؟
I think there's some hope that as a business, Mr. Musk is going to improve Twitter and increase the revenues that they raise and bring new users into the Twitter system. The other thing that's going on in America, of course, is not just what's happening inside Twitter, but there are major debates inside the government, both the federal government and in state governments, about the power and size and role of social media companies in the culture. So Mr. Musk doesn't get to decide on his own how these issues are going to be resolved. There are lots of people who are making law and enforcing law that will have input into what comes now.
مثلا الاتحاد الأوروبي أقر تشريعات جديدة فيما يتعلق بعمل منصات التواصل الاجتماعي ووجه تحذيرات مباشرة لماسك. هل يمكن أن يحدث هذا في الولايات المتحدة؟
What a wonderful, smart question. It is not clear whether new laws will be passed, and even if the new laws are passed, whether the judicial system, whether the courts in America will allow any new laws that limit speech to be enacted. Americans place a lot of value on the freedom of expression and are very concerned about any limits on freedom of expression. And so the courts will play a really important role in deciding what the tone of the social media environment is going to be and what kinds of speech will be allowed on social media. So there are lots of actors in America who still will have a say over what goes on inside this company.
موقع أكسيوس الأمريكي وصف إيلون ماسك بأنه بات أقوى شخص في أمريكا خارج البيت الأبيض. ما حجم هذه القوة وهذا التأثير برأيك؟
There's a very broad view that Mr. Musk agrees with, that Twitter is like the town square of America. It's the online place where people gather, argue with each other, fight with each other, promote ideas and try to win supporters around their ideas. And so there are ways in which the broad American culture is very much involved in these stories. America has a long history, long before the internet, of powerful people becoming media owners. They own newspapers, they own TV stations, they own radio stations to try to influence the culture. Mr. Musk is now part of that long history in America where powerful people buy a media property and then try to influence the culture in a very broad way. And he will be a powerful man. What he believes and what he wants to happen will change some of the elements of American culture. But America is a big, diverse country, and Twitter is only one of the parts of the media and information ecosystem that is in play now. Twitter in the United States is about the third of the size of Facebook. So there are not nearly as many users of Twitter in the United States as there are Facebook or Instagram or Pinterest. And so Twitter is important. It's very important to the civic and media culture of the United States, but actually fewer than a quarter of Americans, 23% of American adults use Twitter. So it's not that big of a group. It has influence, but it is not the only influencer in the very broad American political and social culture.
كيف يمكن تحميل وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي مسؤوليتها القانونية بينما هي لا تتبع للقوانين الملزمة للمؤسسات الإعلامية؟ بعبارة أخرى، هي لديها سلطة على الخطاب وعلى تداوله على صفحاتها، وفي الوقت نفسه معفاة من المتابعة القانونية مثل ما يحدث مع الصحف مثلا.
Yes, It's a really very smart point to be making. And we're just in this period now where the whole tone of media and information has been changed since the internet and digitization has come into being. Lots more people now can have a platform to promote their views. It used to be that the owners of newspapers and radio stations and TV stations were the powerful voices in a culture. Now, thanks to social media, there are influencers that can come from any corner of the culture. They can come from anywhere. They can come up from the smallest village in the country. They can come from the poorest neighborhood in this inside of a city. And so the whole power arrangement of how information gets promoted in a culture has changed thanks to the internet and social media. We are wrestling with a whole new set of ideas about who gets to speak and what they get to say that has been brought to our legislatures and to our courts thanks to social media, because it's a brand new world now where the power of any individual to gather an audience and to say things to that audience is unlike anything we've ever seen in history.
تعتقد سيعود ترامب إلى تويتر؟
When Mr. Trump was thrown off Twitter, about half of Americans thought that was a good idea, and the other half thought that was a horrible idea. And so Americans are very divided about the role of Mr. Trump on Twitter and about what Twitter has the power to do to people like Mr. Trump. And it will be interesting to see, you know, he's building his own social media company. He has said he does not want to return to Twitter, but a lot of Americans probably think that that's not the final word on what's going to happen.
ماذا عن العوائد الاقتصادية لماسك بعد امتلاكه لتويتر؟ عدا طبعا الهدف النبيل المتعلق بحرية التعبير.
Yes, there are important business considerations that now will probably be revised if Mr. Musk is allowed to take over the company. Right now, you know, you can create fake Twitter accounts. There are millions and millions and millions of bots on Twitter. You don't have to pay anything to use Twitter. And so there are ways in which people are now suggesting that instead of relying on advertising, which means that Twitter has to collect a lot of data about its users and then share that data with advertisers, there are people who say that's not as good a model to make money as subscriptions. Make people pay for Twitter, and you'll potentially clear up some of the problems with the platform, but you'll also potentially make a lot more money. And so one of the most interesting stories now that comes from Mr. Musk's purchase of Twitter is what he does to the business. How he decides to raise revenues, how he decides to collect data from users and sell it to advertisers, and just generally the whole business model of social media is very much in play now.
ماسك تحدث عن الحياد السياسي. لماذا يبدو صعب التصنيف وهناك الكثير من الجدل حول اتجاهاته السياسية على وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي؟
Mr. Musk is a very important and powerful man, and with lots of different interests in the world. And he has interesting political views. He would describe himself as a libertarian. He very in favor of limited government, not many government rules about how businesses should operate, about how speech should be regulated and things like that. And so there are ways in which the complexity of his personality and the complexity of the business environment he's in make him hard to classify in some respects, because the business interests he has might be at odds with some of the free speech ideas that he has. And we'll just see how he balances these different factors as he begins to run the company and make decisions about how it's going to make money, how it's going to change, who should be employed there, what should happen on the platform, and all those kinds of things. But one of the most interesting things that now sort of fits into this story of his purchase of Twitter is the American political culture. It's a very polarized, divided culture, and he is perceived to be someone who is more conservative than liberal, but there are lots of ways that his ideas align with liberal ideas. And there are lots of ways that there are things that he might be doing or things that his business might mean that wouldn't be terribly pleasing to conservatives. So I think he's got interesting choices to make. And there are ways in which the polarized environment in America is going to be watching and making decisions about whether they are favorable to conservatives or favorable to liberals, or might be doing something completely different from all of that.
ما تفسيرك للجدل الدائر حول تغيير المقر الرئيس لتويتر إلى ولايات أخرى كتكساس مثلاً؟
There are two big things that are driving that conversation, which are really interesting and maybe unique about America. The first is that in our layered government system, the federal government does some things, but state governments are allowed to do lots of other things. So state governments make rules about speech, about consumer speech, about legal speech, about political speech, and then the federal government makes rules about all of that too. So in some respects, where he chooses to locate the headquarters of the company might signal kind of which state laws he likes more, but there are also federal laws that could supersede those state laws, and there are judicial rules that might supersede those laws. The other consideration that always applies to when people decide where to locate a business are the state laws about incorporation and what the tax laws are and what corporations are allowed to do. So it's not just a business decision, but it's a decision about the legal status of the corporation too. And it'll be interesting to see whether he makes a change there.
أخيراً أريدك أن تقيم أداء تويتر قبل ماسك، وهل فعلاً كانت هناك قيود على حرية التعبير؟
These are brand new media spaces, and we're struggling as a culture, and the legal system is struggling to figure out whether old laws about speech, about corporations and their behavior, about what media properties should do, whether those old laws still apply or whether a whole new set of laws and a whole new set of legal principles ought to be applied to this new environment. And so all of that confusion and commotion is influencing the thing that you were talking about, what happens to free speech. And we are trying to figure out as a nation what changes might need to be made when speech now means something very different from what it used to mean before the internet and social media came into existence. Speech, American free speech laws and rules used to apply entirely to the government. Free speech in America, by our Constitution, means the government itself cannot limit people's speech. But now these powerful corporations like Twitter can make decisions about who can use the platform, what can they say, when can they be kicked off if they say the wrong thing. And so this is a different kind of consideration from the things that used to matter in America about what free speech meant. So we're going to argue about this probably for the next generation, and you and I will be talking in 20 years about some of these same issues as they have been reconfigured.
لريني، شكرا جزيلا لك للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
Nice to be with you.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.